side, I would like to welcome and introduce our speaker this morning. Katie Gasparelli is a physiotherapist. She received her physiotherapy degree at the University of Ottawa in 2004. She also completed her Master of Science in Rehabilitation at McMaster University in 2014. She works at Six Nations Health Services on the Six Nations of the Grand River Territory near Brantford, Ontario. And she currently works as the team leader to support the Diabetes Education Program, Health Promotion Program, and Therapy Services team. She is the Indigenous Health Representative on the Global Health Division Executive Committee of the CPA. So with no further ado, I'll pass it over to you, Katie.
Thank you, Leanne. So the health status of Indigenous people across Canada, from urban centres to remote communities, is poor. Chronic and communicable diseases are in some cases 30 times the national average when compared with the non-Indigenous population. Suicide and self-inflicted injuries are the leading causes of death among youth and adults up to the age of 44. These health inequities are a result of colonial policies. Policies driven by the types of ideologies you see on your screen are what motivated the implementation of the Indian residential school system, a system which institutionalized young Indigenous children. It punished them for speaking their own language and in many instances subjected them to emotional, physical, and sexual abuses. So before I get too far into a presentation, I like to acknowledge the land that we're on. It's definitely a little bit more challenging when people are in different locations. So the two things that I will do is, one, acknowledge the land that I am on today, and I'm in a location near Brantford, which is the territory of the Haudenosaunee people, the Six Nations of the Grand River Territory. These are also the traditional territories of the Mississaugas of the First of New Credit, which are an Ojibwe people, and then there a third nation also occupied these lands previous to contact, and they were called the Neutrals. So the other thing I'd like to do is acknowledge the land on which the Physiotherapy Alberta office is in Edmonton, and it sits on Treaty 6, which is a treaty with the Plains, the Wood Cree, Nakota, Saulteaux, and Dene nations. So I'd just like you to take a moment to reflect, if you're outside of Edmonton, to think about what traditional territory you're on, if you know what that is, or if you're not aware, it might be an interesting exercise to look into that and find out. So the second thing that I like to do is to tell you a little bit more about myself so that you can understand the lens from which I work and the lens from which I'm presenting to you today. So I'm a member of the Six Nations of the Grand River Territory. I'm Haudenosaunee, Tuscarora Nation, but I grew up off reserve in Northern Ontario in a small town, and I had a very mainstream upbringing. I get my Indigenous heritage from my mother and my Italian settler heritage from my father. After I graduated from the University of Ottawa with my physiotherapy degree, I returned to Northern Ontario to work as a physiotherapist. I worked in Wawa, which is my hometown, for a short period of time. And then I moved to Sioux Lookout, which is in the northwest of Ontario. And I had the opportunity to fly up to Indigenous communities north of Sioux Lookout to provide physiotherapy services. And this experience helped me to understand the geographical barrier to accessing healthcare that exists in northern parts of Canada. So after that, I worked a short time in Thunder Bay before moving here to Brantford to work at Six Nations Health Services. I've been working here 9 years, and I still have a lot of family here at Six Nations, and I spent a little bit of time growing up here, just visiting family. But it was never really my intention to return to this community, which is interesting because this is a community that I call home now. So I don't present to you as an expert in Indigenous health by any means. I can't offer you sort of a flow sheet or a how-to work with all Indigenous people across Canada. But what I'm offering to you today is a little bit of my knowledge, my experience in working with my own community and what I've learned along the way. And it's really essential to understand that each and every community is very different. Different cultures, different ways of doing things. Even within my own community, there are different kind of family lines who do traditional ceremonies a little differently. And just to demonstrate how diverse it is, just in Ontario, there are 133 different First Nations communities. So across the country, I'm not even sure what that number looks like, but I think it can be very large. So I am the Indigenous Health Representative on the Global Health Division. That is a fairly new position. I've been in it, first one in it, and I've been in it for 2 years now. I just wanted to acknowledge that the subcommittee, so I have a subcommittee that works with me, and they were part of developing this presentation as well. So that's Hillary Crawley, Sarah Osman, Moni Freak, Stephanie Nixon, and Amanda Fortin. And we originally presented this at Congress in Victoria last year, and so I will present some of the content that we developed through the workshop at Congress as well near the end. So back to this slide about residential school, and what does residential school have to do with physiotherapy? So I wanted to introduce the residential school because the Truth and Reconciliation Commission of Canada was part of the Indian Residential Schools Settlement Agreement, which was reached in 2005. So this settlement was a result of a class action lawsuit against the Government of Canada for the institutionalization of thousands of Indigenous children. And the mandate of the TRC was threefold. So it was to do the truth telling so that people could tell their stories about what happened in residential schools, the healing so that it could help in the process of healing for all that were involved in residential schools, and also to work towards reconciliation. So the first step was identifying the three commissioners. So there's a picture there. The person on the left-hand side is Justice Murray Sinclair. So he was Manitoba's first Indigenous judge. He is now a senator. The person in the middle, the woman there, is Dr. Marie Wilson, and she's a journalist and has worked in many capacities for the CBC, both in Canada and internationally. And the third person, the man on the right-hand side of the picture, is Chief Wilton Lilchild. And he is a lawyer and politician and was the Grand Regional Chief of Alberta, I believe, at one point. So the commissioners were chosen, and they also developed an advisory committee. So this advisory committee had 10 seats on it, and it was made up of Indian residential school survivors. And so that committee served as an advisory body to the process of the TRC and helped inform the process that the commissioners were going to undertake. So the whole process took 6 years, and during those 6 years, they traveled across the country and they listened to nearly 7,000 testimonies. And I've watched a couple of television shows, and Justice Sinclair was actually here in Brantford to do a talk, and he talked a lot about how difficult it was for all of the commissioners to listen to all of those testimonies over all of those years, and spoke a lot about the self-care that needed to happen in between the sessions that they had, because it was so difficult to listen to the stories that the survivors told. So I think it's really important to hear from survivors. So I'm going to show a short clip in a minute. But I like to do this because I think sometimes a lot of people can think that residential schools is something that happened in the past and that it's over and done with, and we don't really have to think about it anymore. But there are many survivors among us. I meet lots of clients in our community here at Six Nations who bring it up themselves and talk about being at residential schools. So it's not something that's that far in the past. There are still many people who experienced it firsthand who are still alive with us today.
I got frightened when I was a little girl when the principal used to beat up the other children like boys. The boys got the most beating. They used to call it bench party, and it was usually done after supper, and that's where I got frightened because I saw blood.
I remember when we had to shower. You only have to show me how to shower and clean and wash myself, how to wash my private and my, private parts of your body. You don't have to show a kid once or twice at the most, but not every day. And have the supervisor come in there and basically take advantage of you.
I just remember arriving there and donning new clothes and, of course, getting a haircut and sitting in a classroom and being with other girls and witnessing my brother get punched by the supervisor.
My name is Alice Little Deer. I'm 78 years old. I spent about 8 years in residential school.
My name is Raymond Mason. I'm 62 years old, and I attended residential school for 12 years.
I'm Madeline Dion Stout. I'm 62 years old. I'm from the Kihiwan First Nation in Alberta. I attended Blue Quills Residential School for 36 consecutive months. That would be 3 years.
In order to educate the children properly, we must separate them from their families. Some people may say that this is hard, but if we want to civilize them, we must do that. A federal cabinet minister, 1883.
I remember them taking me away from my...
So just a note on that clip. It was from CBC's The National that was posted to their YouTube channel on June 2nd, 2015. So June 2015 is when the Commission released its report. And the report is essentially the outcome of the 6 years of the Commission. They published, so the first volume is the summary, and there are 5 other volumes that describe more in detail the findings of the Commission. In the Commission report, they identify 94 specific calls to action, and there are 7 calls that are directly related to health in the report that I'd like to review with you. But before we do that, we'll have a look at just one more clip, and this clip is from AJ Plus. It's a global news community on YouTube, and this was published in June 2015 as well.
What took place in residential schools amounts to nothing short of cultural genocide.
The messages that they gave us, like we were heathens, we were pagans. My way of life was no good.
Okay, so we'll go through the 7 calls to action. Sorry, I skipped ahead one here. We'll go back. So all of the calls to action are numbered 1 through 94, and the ones to health start at number 18. So this one is that we call upon the federal, provincial, territorial, and Aboriginal governments to acknowledge that the current state of Aboriginal health in Canada is a direct result of previous Canadian government policies, including residential schools, and to recognize and implement the healthcare rights of Aboriginal people as identified in international law and constitutional law and under the treaty. Number 19, we call upon the federal government in consultation with Aboriginal peoples to establish measurable goals to identify and close the gaps in health outcomes between Aboriginal and non-Aboriginal communities, and to publish annual progress reports and assess long-term trends. Such efforts would focus on indicators such as infant mortality, mental health, suicide, maternal health, addictions, life expectancy, birth rate, infant and child health issues, chronic diseases, illness and injury incidents, and the availability of appropriate health services. Number 20, in order to address the jurisdictional disputes concerning Aboriginal people who do not reside on reserves, we call upon the federal government to recognize, respect, and address the distinct health needs of the Métis, Inuit, and off-reserve Aboriginal peoples. Number 21, we call upon the federal government to provide sustainable funding for existing and new Aboriginal healing centres to address the physical, mental, emotional, and spiritual harms caused by residential schools, and to ensure that the funding of healing centres in Nunavut and the Northwest Territories is a priority. Number 22, we call upon those who can affect change within the Canadian healthcare system to recognize the value of Aboriginal healing practices and use them in the treatment of Aboriginal patients in collaboration with Aboriginal healers and elders where requested by Aboriginal patients. Number 23, we call upon all levels of government to increase the number of Aboriginal professionals working in the healthcare field, ensure the retention of Aboriginal healthcare providers in Aboriginal communities, and provide cultural competency training for all healthcare professionals. And the last one, specific to health, number 24, we call upon medical and nursing schools in Canada, and I wish that was a little bit more generic, talking about all healthcare professional schools, to require all students to take a course dealing with Aboriginal health issues, including the history and legacy of residential schools, the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, treaties and Aboriginal rights, and Indigenous teachings and practices. This will require skills-based training in intercultural competency, conflict resolution, human rights, and anti-racism. So those are the 7 that directly relate to health, but if you have a read through all of the calls to action within the TRC, you'll see that there are other places where health kind of weaves through a lot of them. So I thought we would define reconciliation here, as that was one of the mandates of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission. So the term reconciliation was defined in the Indian Residential School Settlement Agreement as an ongoing and collective process that will require commitment from all those affected, including First Nations, Inuit and Métis former Indian residential school students, their families, communities, religious entities, former school employees, government, and the people of Canada. So reconciliation is really a process for all Canadians to engage in. I think it's really important that we're doing this in the context of being healthcare providers and physiotherapists, but This process will require us each individually to reflect on how we can improve the relationship between Indigenous and non-Indigenous people across Canada. So that being said, there's a nice clip from one of the commissioners, Dr. Marie Wilson, that I will play, and she speaks about what she sees as a next step now that the commission has completed their work.
I think the issue of how people feel is relevant only in as much as it determines how people act. Wringing our hands and crying and feeling shame and humiliation has been a huge part of the reaction that many non-Indigenous people have expressed as they have learned about this. But they also realize, and we have certainly been insistent in saying this, we can't stop with that. We have to now that we know, what do we do about all this? And I think the thing that has been the greatest learning curve, because everyone wants to believe, well, this had nothing to do with me. I wasn't part of that. The fact is that we live in a country where we are all bound by our laws. We are all affected directly or indirectly by government policies. And we are all deemed to be citizens within this country. And so everything that happens to one or some has a bearing on all of us. In this case, one of the common reactions that we hear, especially from the young people, because we've made a very intentional effort to reach out to high school students and to have them learn about this history, engage with survivors and so on, those young people are mad. They are upset that they have learned about trouble spots in so many other parts of the world, conflicts in so many other parts of the world, but they have not been taught a complete history of what happened in our own country. But having said that, what's really encouraging is that they want to know, and they immediately see the unfairness of it, the unjustness of it, and they immediately talk about what they are going to do, what they're going to do and go home and tell their parents, what they're going to do if they see something unfair, what they deem to be unjust happening to someone in their daily living. And so that's really good. And I think that is so the feeling part is valuable in that it is transformative. If we start to know more than we knew before, then we can start to shift our attitudes about things that we thought we knew before, but in fact may have been misinformed. And then we can start to shift then our actions that flow from those attitudes. And I think that the goodness of Canadians is what will determine what becomes of all of this. I think people have a very deep sense of wanting to believe in good values within our country. It is the reputation that we've taken into the world about ourselves. And now it is our home challenge to live up to that in our own country. And I think that's, as I say, it's not about how you feel. It's about figuring out what can I do. We have said repeatedly that the most essential thing to understand about all of this history is that it implicates all of us. And that reconciliation, that part of our mandate that is about inspiring reconciliation, it's not about addressing problems in Aboriginal communities and sort of getting Aboriginal people to figure out how to solve their own problems, although there are elements that are exactly about that. It is about the broader question of how does Canadian society have to heal itself? How do we have to heal from our own collective ignorance about the history of our own country as regards our relationship with Indigenous peoples? And what do we have to do to make sure that we never slide back into that way of not knowing, and that we use our new understanding in positive ways? And I think that that will help us, I think, understand much more. I think the more we know about what has happened, and indeed what we as a society have done in order to get the advantage over Indigenous peoples, to get the advantage in rounding up children so that we could maneuver to have access to more lands and more resources, the more we understand how those things fit together, the more I think we can start to be noble in our response to some of the very contemporary issues that we have about a fair share of resources, about equitable funding for education, about equitable funding for child welfare services, none of which are in fact realities in Canada right now. And at what point do we stand up and speak up to our own values, which says that's not right. It wasn't right in the past, and it's certainly not right in the present.
I know that was a bit of a long video clip, but I think that she does a really great job at helping to understand what maybe our actions can be in the future. After hearing kind of all of these terrible things about residential school and the commission, so what next? So I think she does that really well. We'll go on to try and connect again a little bit more the experience of residential school and how that has impacted health and wellness in Indigenous communities in Canada. And just a little bit about our population. You may or may not know this, but that we are a growing population, which is slightly different from the non-Indigenous population. So lots of young children, 14 years and under, and even our cohort between the ages of 15 to 24, a lot more of us within our own population compared to the non-Indigenous population. So young and growing, essentially. However, as mentioned a couple of times previously, our health status is not good. We have higher rates of chronic diseases such as diabetes, obesity, arthritis, cancer. Our suicide rates are up to 10 times as high as in non-Indigenous communities in Canada. Some communities have higher rates, some communities have lower rates. A lot of that is dependent on other factors within the community. High rates of mental health illness and high rates of substance use. So what's the connection? What's the connection between our health status and the experience of residential school and other colonial influences on us? Some of you may have heard of ACEs already, but if you haven't, it can really help you understand that link between residential school experience of Indigenous people and how that translates into poor health outcomes that we see today. So this slide is from the CDC. This study was done in the 90s, and I believe it was published in 1997. So ACEs are adverse childhood experiences. And what the research demonstrated was that there is a dose-response relationship to ACEs. So the more adverse childhood experiences you have early on in your lifetime, the more likely you are to have development of chronic disease and early death. So they defined these adverse childhood experiences into 7 categories. They included psychological, physical, or sexual abuse, violence against a mother, or living in a household where the household members were once either substance users, they were mentally ill or suicidal, or had ever been imprisoned. So when a child experiences these really terrible things in their lives, what that can do is it can disrupt typical neurodevelopment. And when we disrupt typical neurodevelopment, we can have social, emotional, and cognitive impairments. These impairments then can increase our likelihood of adopting risky behaviors, and those risky behaviors can be using drugs or alcohol, taking risks like driving a car at fast speeds, not wearing seatbelts. So just making sort of poor decisions about different things that you do in your life. These behaviors can then result in either disease, disability, social problems, which in turn can result in early death. So I find that this pyramid can really kind of help to see how those things can play on one another, and how, when we talk about intergenerational trauma too, is how a child even who is raised in a family where it was the grandmother or the great-grandmother that went to residential school, that once you're in that kind of environment where you're experiencing those types of environments that have negative influences on you, you kind of fall into this pyramid as well. So that's how that gets passed along, essentially, one way anyhow. So what the research demonstrated was that as the number of ACEs increases, so does the risk for things like alcoholism, alcohol abuse, chronic diseases like COPD, liver disease, poor work performance, financial stress. We have behaviors like smoking can lead to suicide attempts, unintended pregnancies, risk for sexual violence, and the list kind of goes on and on and on. So I am by no means an expert in trauma, but I think that I wanted to share this TED Talk, and I'm not going to show any of the video clips from it, but it's about 15 minutes long, and it really is a great talk to help you understand how those adverse childhood experiences can influence health outcomes. So after talking about all this awful stuff, and as much as we need to understand all of these things and how they've influenced our health status to this day in Indigenous communities, I'd like to talk a little bit about resiliency. Because despite all of the negative influences that colonialism has brought and the efforts that the government has made over the last few hundred years to try and assimilate or absorb Indigenous people into a more Western mainstream type of lifestyle, many cultures have maintained languages. We have maintained traditional knowledge to be able to live and practice our ceremonies and our medicines. And there is a real desire, it seems like, definitely in my own community, and but I do get that sense from talking to other people across the country, that there's a real interest in Indigenous people kind of going back to that knowledge so that they can figure out how to incorporate it in their lives today. Much of it was lost, or at least it was lost to some people, but within communities, it still exists to some degree. And so what we're trying to do in our community here at Six Nations is really to support the people and the organizations that are trying to develop our languages, develop traditional medicine practitioners and support them. So we're really trying to connect with those things and help support them so that more and more people have a chance to learn about them and experience them. One of the things that we have really focused on in our diabetes education program and also in our health promotion program is our Indigenous foods. So having a look back at what did we used to eat pre-contact, what can we still access today, and how do we incorporate more of those things into our diet, because those are the things that we were meant to eat. I was trying to engage people in a walking program to come. We have a beautiful new track at our community center outside, and people were really hesitant and had a lot of questions, right? People who have chronic diseases are often worried about how far do I have to walk to get out of the car to get to the track? What's the surface look like? Is it uneven? Is it, do I have a place to sit down and rest? So there was a lot of fear of the unknown about engaging in this activity. But then when we invited the same clients to come and harvest corn with us, there was none of that. And so even though from my perspective it was a much more challenging place to go and do activity, because it seemed like because it wasn't focused on just the exercise piece or the movement piece, it was more around a functional task and one that connects to traditional ways and identity, that all of those fears and questions fell away and people just came and really were able to just participate in the activity and really enjoy themselves. And at the same time, get some movement into their lives that they might not otherwise do. So I just challenge you to look for opportunities like that when you're working with other communities. So we'll come back, and I just, as a last piece, wanted to share with you some of the thoughts that were generated around the call to action specific to health from our session at Congress in 2016. So what we did was we chose 5 of the 7 and grouped 2 together so that we had 4 discussion groups going, and then asked them this question here, which is, what is the relevance to this recommendation for physiotherapy as individuals and as a profession across Canada? So from the calls to action 18 and 24, 18 related to colonial policies and recognizing Indigenous rights, and number 24 was about all medical nursing schools to require students to take a course in Aboriginal health issues. So the question was posed, who needs to change, and noted that a lot of the recommendations require changes not necessarily among Indigenous people, but among healthcare providers, healthcare educators, health systems, which does require humility and an openness to new ways of thinking. Another thought was that junior PTs may have a little bit more insight than senior PTs, given that the history of Indigenous people wasn't present previously in high school curriculum, but more recently it has started to be added into the curriculum, and so those who have graduated more recently may have had some of that education in high school. And third, that the escalating demand for Indigenous education is exciting. So when they talk about trying to provide that education for healthcare providers as they are developing, but it creates challenges because there are a limited number of people who have this expertise. So to be conscious and respect the many demands on our Indigenous colleagues, and also to look at existing educational toolkits, let's say online courses and things like that, as well as expertise among Indigenous healthcare providers in other professions that can help and lend a hand in that. So the next group discussed the call to action number 19, and number 19 was to identify and close the gaps in health outcomes. So the thoughts of the group were that physiotherapy-related research with Indigenous individuals, communities, agencies requires long-term collaborative partnerships, and it should start with community-driven research questions, and that's consistent with the Tri-Council policy statement. Also that the Physiotherapy Foundation of Canada should consider a call for research projects specific to Indigenous health issues within our profession, and that physiotherapy-related research in Indigenous health would benefit from a mixed methodology approach grounded in cultural humility. That term coming back again. The next group discussed the call to action number 22 was recognizing the value of Indigenous healing practices and trying to incorporate them or make them available when requested. So one thing that's necessary is to build knowledge to decrease fear about Indigenous healing practices. So is there an opportunity to use existing frameworks for interprofessional care to introduce Indigenous health practitioners to other health providers? And maybe explore how the CPA or regulatory bodies might develop expectations or competencies around this idea. Create opportunities for dialogue with patients and others about Indigenous healing practices. It's okay to ask patients if they're taking them. And explore your own thoughts, beliefs, and values and how that impacts on your ability to implement this recommendation. The final one that we discussed at Congress was the call to action number 23, and this was about increasing the number of Aboriginal healthcare practitioners, retention of those practitioners within Aboriginal communities, and providing cultural competency training. So one recommendation was that we could enhance the number of Indigenous specific scholarships, such as the ones available through CPA. That was new last year, and they have it again available this year. engage with and recruit Indigenous youth with in-person workshops and recruitment videos that are created in partnership with communities to ensure that it's culture-based and relevant to the community. Revise the PT essential competencies to include Indigenous health awareness and cultural humility for students and clinicians, and include enhanced cultural awareness curricula and increased flexibility in the way of measuring success within the university programs. So those are just some thoughts about how we might as individuals or as a profession take up some of these calls to action and to move forward. So just some food for thought. A few things that I'd just like to leave you with is I think that it's important for everyone to actually read the TRC. The book is, the summary anyhow, they say it takes about 8 hours to read cover to cover. Definitely something that's worth reading with someone so that you can kind of discuss and talk about what you've read and how you think that kind of impacts on how you do things in your work or in your day-to-day life. The other piece of literature I think is well worth the read is the document titled First People's Second Class Treatment. And that was released, I believe, maybe just before the TRC in 2014 or 2015. And it really speaks to racism in healthcare and how First Nations, Métis, and Inuit people experience health services across the country. And it can really help to start that discussion around racism. The one takeaway I guess I would say for engaging with people who are Indigenous is to really just engage with your client for the sole purpose of developing trust. So there can be a real mistrust with Western ways, Western systems because of historical relationships and experiences. And so it's really important to just want to develop trust in your first meeting or first few meetings with a patient and do not bring your own sort of physiotherapy agenda to the table, or at least put it aside for a couple of times before so that you can develop trust and that you can engage in a truly effective therapeutic relationship in the end. And also trying to find the strength within individuals or within communities to help find a way forward. And this is really what's called trauma-informed care, probably new to many physiotherapists, but very prominent in mental health care right now. So I do recommend that you kind of start to browse around that literature. Very relevant for us, but I by no means have the capacity to talk much more about that, except that there are many 2-, 3-, 4-day courses about how to implement trauma-informed care within the healthcare services we provide. And the final thing is really just to practice reflexivity, so to really practice cultural humility, reflect on your thoughts and feelings while you're interacting and after you've interacted with Indigenous clients to ensure that you can understand where your biases are and how you can overcome them to fully engage in a positive way with your client. So I've just put a couple of resources here. Knowing the Land Beneath Our Feet was an initiative at UBC, so sort of that land acknowledgement project. There's an interesting episode on New Fire. It's a CBC podcast. And then there's also, people have taken up reading the TRC on YouTube, so they've chosen a certain section of pages and they're reading it to increase accessibility of the TRC. So you don't have to necessarily sit down and read the book, but you can listen to it through different clips. Okay, so we have just a little bit of time for questions.
Thanks, Katie. So at the moment, we do have that clip from the UBC. Wanted to show it regarding the Land Beneath Your Feet. But while we wait for people to type in some questions, I did have one question come in from Heather talking about reconciliation. When you were talking about reconciliation, you talked a lot about the parties that were involved in reconciliation. But I'm wondering, TRC, or if any of the discussions you've had since the TRC came out with colleagues and with members of your community, have you got any insight as to what true reconciliation would look like? And is it understanding and awareness? Is that enough, or what does it really look like? What's the end point if we were to say we were reconciled?
I think if we were reconciled, and it's not, I mean, this is going to take generations. I think we have to be okay with that as well, that it took us a long time to get here. The residential school system existed for over 100 years, and it's going to take at least that to get back to a positive place. So it's not going to happen overnight, but I think that that we would all be equal, I guess. So there wouldn't be this disparity between Indigenous and non-Indigenous people in Canada in terms of health status, in terms of education status, in terms of socioeconomic status, in terms of food insecurity. So all of those social determinants of health would be comparable to non-Indigenous Canadians. That's my interpretation anyhow, my personal view.
Fair enough. I think that gives a lot of food for thought about the distance we have to go to reach that point.
Mm-hmm. And those are big things and complex things to fix. And so again, that's just why it's going to take some time.
We were talking beforehand, Katie, about the importance of land acknowledgement, and it strikes me that it might be worth you sharing what you told me before about the cultural significance of land acknowledgement discussion that we had offline.
Sure.
If you would.
Yeah. So Leanne had asked what is it something that Indigenous people do? Is it something non-Indigenous people should do? She had heard that many schools have taken up this act of acknowledging land as they open school for the day. And so I think it is an important part. I think it does come from our traditional ways. Generally, if you came to visit somebody on their territory, you would acknowledge and thank them for allowing you to come and to be in that place with them and to share that space. So I think that's one thing. It's sort of a way that we would normally interact from a nation-to-nation perspective. And then also, I think it's a reminder to all Canadians, because we can kind of get wrapped up in our day-to-day and just go about doing things and not really think what has allowed us to develop Canada in this way, what has allowed us to have the space and the access to our resources. And it might not be a great relationship in many instances, but it is, this land used to be lived on in a very different way, and acknowledging that there were people here before it looked the way that it looks, and it was used differently by different people, acknowledges that. And I think it's just a reminder, and I think it will help to create that awareness among people to just be a little bit more reflective when they step outside and walk around their environment that they're living and working in.
Thanks for that, Katie. That it certainly was helpful for me to hear your perspective on that, because it is something that I'm seeing more and more in my own world, and understanding the importance of it. And I think the historical significance of it was really very interesting to me to hear that this is a tradition that's been around for some time. It's not a new thing. So I thought that was very interesting. And when we talk about recommendation number 24, and the recommendation around educating our students, our physiotherapy students, our health providers as they're coming through, you spoke to this really well when you commented that that's very good, but there's a number of us that have been in practice who really don't have the education that perhaps our new colleagues do have around this, because so much of that history has not been told. So, that was why we planned this presentation, and I'm so glad that you were able to speak to our audience today. We do have a little bit more time for questions, so I'll invite the audience to type in any questions they may have to the chat pod. In the meantime, do you want to show the video clip of Knowing the Land Beneath Our Feet from UBC? Just the next slide? Okay. Yeah. We'll give everyone a chance to catch up and type in their questions while we look at that.
Hi, my name is Sarah Ling.
And I'm Spencer Lindsay, and we first met at the UBC First Nation Studies program, and we're the coordinators of Knowing the Land Beneath Our Feet.
The University of British Columbia is on unceded Musqueam territory. UBC is full of Indigenous presence. Do you know about the Kwakwaka'wakw totem pole that came from the bottom of the sea? Or the Musqueam warrior village of Kayapalano? Many of these important stories have been buried under the development of UBC. We want to make these familiar spaces productively unfamiliar.
We created Knowing the Land Beneath Our Feet to connect people to the land and honor the deep Indigenous histories and continued uses of this land.
It is more than just a walking tour. It is about understanding our presence on Musqueam land.
All right. Well, there don't seem to be any other questions from the audience at this time, but Katie, I think you've given us all a lot to think about, both in terms of the TRC recommendations themselves, but also the implications of the history of our country on the problems we're seeing among our populations that we may care for in our Indigenous populations, and also in terms of just looking at things a bit differently. So I really do thank you for your time today and for your presentation. I think it was very informative, and really appreciate you taking the time to be here with us.
Great. Thank you very much for having me. And I just want to put a little plug in for the Global Health Division, that we're always looking for more people to network with and to support the activities that we are trying to do. It seems like from our last survey, there's an interest in having more Indigenous knowledge pushed out through our social media outlets, plus within our newsletter and things like that, but we definitely need more manpower to be able to do that. So we're always looking for other people to engage, whether it's just a one-time thing or to take on a subcommittee position for a certain time frame.
Fair enough, and the information about the Global Health Division website is on the screen. But is there a social media channel that you can also highlight to us, a Facebook page or a Twitter account? Yeah, we have a Facebook account and also a Twitter account, which of course I don't have up with me right now, but the Facebook account, if you look for Global Health Division, it'll come up, Canadian Physiotherapy Association Global Health Division. Thanks very much, Katie, and thanks to everyone who was able to join us today. And with that, we'll call our presentation to a close.